let's launch. So I called this morning's lecture, thank you so much for coming. It is an odd opportunity to talk to people who are as excited about Unitarians in Eastern Europe as I am. It sounds like a pretty fringy thing, but I hope to make the case to you all that it actually is really cool and really important to understanding where we come from as a religion. So the lecture today, A History of Seekers and Freethinkers, was inspired by an experience I had quite a lot growing up. When I would talk to people and religion would come up and people would say, oh, what are you? And I'd say, well, I'm a Unitarian Universalist. Most of the time I would get just blank looks like, what's that? And if they were interested, they'd ask, basic questions. So what do you people believe? And are you Christians? And I'd say, well, some of us are, and some of us aren't. And there'd be confusion. And, well, do you believe in Jesus? And, well, some of us do, and some of us don't. And then, some of us are still working on exactly how we think of Jesus. And at this point, the conversation would end, and people would just throw up their hands and decide, I think, that I belong to some New Age cult or something. It was always very frustrating for me. And I spent a lot of my 20s in Eastern Europe, and people would ask, and most of these people were Catholics or Orthodox people whose churches had been around forever. And I would always feel like, the silly American who's got this religion that maybe is, 150 years old, maybe, right? So I continued my studies, and as I studied Eastern European history, I always kept my eyes open for these people. I kept running into them, and they were called anti-Trinitarians. And I was like, anti-Trinitarians? That sounds like Unitarians. Like, who are these people? And when I discovered that these folks were often out on the radical fringe of the religious scene in their time and place, and that they were often considered heretics by the people around them, I thought, those are my people. And so I did quite a lot of research into these various groups. They kind of appear and disappear in different parts of Eastern Europe over several hundred years. And I found that, in fact, they are our people. These are people who were seekers and freethinkers who didn't fit into categorical boxes. They didn't have a set doctrine or list of things they believed. They didn't label themselves as Lutherans or Calvinists. They were the ones who kept looking for the answers, who were comfortable being outside the box. And so I started to trace the first sighting of these people back in time. Could I have my slides? Are you on there? Yep. Super. Now we're sharing with Zoom, so our folks at home can admire my slideshow. Perfect. We are sharing. Yep, no worries. I start off with a map because no one knows where Eastern Europe is. It's a problem I face. All of my students complain because my slideshows are 80% maps. The boundaries of Eastern European countries kept changing. It's hard to remember. Where is Bohemia? All right, there we go. Okay, all right, so starting with the map. I don't know if you can get rid of that display at the bottom there, Pete, but that's fine. So the region we're talking about is the circled area that's kind of orange, kind of blue, kind of mixed. This area, since the beginning of Christianization, which came in the 10th century to this part of the world, it's been a religiously mixed area. Missionaries came from Rome and missionaries came from Constantinople, and they brought different versions of Christianity to Eastern Europe. Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, Christian faiths, but with different ideas about everything from whether priests should marry to whether Jesus is fully God or not. Lots of nuanced differences in the theology, but also in the practice. And in Eastern Europe, these two religions have been there since the beginning. These two Christian faiths have been there since the beginning. So we're talking about a part of the world that's more comfortable with religious diversity than Western Europe. It's always been there. Maybe? No, can you advance for me, Pete? We're stuck. We're stuck in Eastern Europe. Much of my 20s, I was stuck in Eastern Europe. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So I have to take you back to 1400s. I know that seems like an impossibly long time ago, but this is what Eastern Europe looked like in the 1400s. There are 4 places that I'm going to talk about today, and it's important for me to know how to find them on a map, so I've given you a map. In order, we're going to talk about Bohemia. We're going to talk about Poland, Lithuania, which is the purple and the pink regions there. And we're going to talk briefly about Moravia and Hungary and end up in Transylvania. These places seem very exotic and far away, but if you look on the map, they're really quite close to each other. And the same dynasties ruled over these territories kind of in a shifting kaleidoscope during this period. So there was a lot of connection among the peoples at courts, royal courts, scholars, priests. They would travel between Krakow and Buda and Prague. This region was fairly well connected, even though we're way back in the 1400s. The other thing that's interesting about this region is that it had 2 of the oldest universities in Europe, Eastern Europe, in Prague and Krakow. Most of the universities in the medieval times were centered in northern Italy. The oldest one started in northern Italy. But in the 1300s, you had significant universities in Prague and Krakow as well. And of course, scholars would travel amongst university towns. They'd visit each other and they'd trade back and forth. And so even though Prague and Krakow look like they're on the edge of Europe there, they are connected to the intellectual scene in the rest of Europe during this period. And here we are, about 1400, you're in the middle of the Italian Renaissance, if you can place that back in your European history classes. You have people who, for the first time in 1,000 years, are digging into ancient texts and biblical texts and saying, what's in there? Translating them, learning ancient languages, comparing translations, investigating what the Bible really says about complicated issues like the Trinity, about communion, about how a good Christian is supposed to live. People are taking reason and kind of critical thinking and digging into religious texts in a big way in the 1400s for the first time in a long time. This is happening in Florence and Padua and Rome, but it's also happening to a limited degree in Eastern Europe. It's just smaller communities, a little less plugged in, but the same conversations, the same questions are coming up in Eastern Europe that are coming up in Italy during the Renaissance. The first guy that we encounter, who's clearly one of ours, is a Bohemian priest named Jan Hus, H-U-S. And he, at the very turn of the 1400s, starts preaching in Prague about a different kind of Christianity than the one that the Pope is selling from Rome. He's quite critical of Roman Catholicism and all of the corruption, the selling of indulgences, the things that eventually caused the Reformation 100 years later. Jan Hus is complaining about them in 1400. And he's speaking to his people in Prague, and he's saying, you know, the Pope in Rome, faraway Rome, shouldn't be the head of the church. The church is the people. The head of the church should be Jesus. If we're all Christians, we should read the Bible, study Jesus' life, and live a simple apostolic Christianity like Jesus and his disciples did. All this business with the Roman papacy, building cathedrals and launching crusades, that shouldn't be what we're doing. Anyway, his very radical, obviously heretical message gets a lot of traction in Bohemia. A lot of people listen to him. They come to his chapel in Prague, and they like what he's offering. They like his interpretation of Christianity. And they become Hussites, Jan Hus, Hussites. And so you have this movement 100 years before Luther of people who are looking for a simpler, more biblical Christianity and who are rejecting the worldliness and corruption of the Catholic Church. Very popular. I know you've never heard of them, but in Bohemia, let me tell you, these are national heroes. This is what Jan Hus's church looks like. You can go to Prague and visit it today. As you can see, it's a pretty classic, simple Protestant church, not unlike our own. These people had similar sensibilities. They didn't like all the fancy, expensive churches that the Roman papacy was building at this time, and instead were looking for a simpler, more authentic and spiritual Christianity. Well, you can imagine what happened to poor Jan Hus. He goes to the church council, he explains his views, he is branded a heretic, and in short order, despite lots of promises for his security, is burnt at the stake as a heretic in 1415. But this is not the end of our Hussites. His followers, like I said, there were many of them, and he was particularly popular among the regular folks, about not super fancy or aristocratic or wealthy people, but regular people who were looking for a simpler, more accessible version of Christianity. They really liked him. And so when the Pope declared Hus and Hussites to be heretics, he launched a crusade against Bohemia. He sent crusaders into Bohemia to crush the heresy. The Bohemians fought back. And they fought back en masse twice. 2 separate crusades were launched against these people, and the Catholic forces lost both times. And so finally, the Pope had to deal with the Hussites and say, all right, what do you need? And they said, well, we would like a simpler service, a simpler kind of Christianity. We're going to nationalize church property, and we would like to have the Mass in Czech rather than in Latin, and we would like to have communion in both kinds. We would like to have bread and wine. At this point, the wine was reserved for the priests, and the common people just got bread, and this created this distance, this hierarchy between the leaders and the people, and the Bohemians didn't like that. They wanted everybody to have communion together as equals. And so the word that comes up in Latin, it's complicated, but it's all right. Utraquist means in both kinds. They want communion in both kinds. They want bread and wine. So these Utraquists agree with the Pope to stop fighting him, and peace is declared in Bohemia, and the Pope actually gives them a special dispensation to have services just like they want. So they get their wine, they get their Czech services, they get their simpler hymns and all that. They win, basically. The Utraquist symbol was the chalice. Right? And it's more than just this theological difference that they wanted, or practice that they wanted to have wine and bread. It's the symbol of it, that we all are equal before God, and so we all partake in the service as equals. Again, like you recognize these people, right? Apparently this is where we get the symbol. The flaming chalice was adopted by the American Unitarians after World War II upon the suggestion of a Czech refugee. There you go. Now, the Utraquists were the more moderate Hussites, and they compromised with the Catholic Church, and they were happy to go about their business. There was a more radical wing of this already rather radical heretical group, and they were called the Bohemian Brethren. Brethren because they just called each other brother and sister. They took this notion of equality of believers to the extreme. We are all equals. We are all brothers and sisters in Christ, as they said. And they went so far as to withdraw from society. They rejected all hierarchy. They rejected war. They were pacifists, so they would not go to war and they would not pay taxes. And instead, they withdrew to these little tiny rural communities where they could practice this simple apostolic Christianity that they themselves read about in the Bible. They, of course, during their time were considered lunatics. Basically hippies who withdraw from society and go live on their own. However, it was a very attractive opportunity for people who were looking for that kind of spiritual experience and that kind of equal and free and peaceful community. And so there are groups of Bohemian brethren who pop up all over Bohemia during this period. Often they get in trouble with the neighbors because they're considered kind of cranks and loonies, but more or less they persist in these communities. And when things get tough for them in Bohemia, there were a series of wars fought for political reasons as well as religious reasons. Some of them move from Bohemia to the neighboring province of Moravia, and they become Moravian brethren. I don't know if you've run into these people, but some of them came to the United States as religious refugees in the 18th century. The Moravians often live in the same kind of communities as Mennonites or Amish. These folks persist to this day. And if you look at their churches in Germany or in Moravia or even in Pennsylvania, they look a lot like ours. These are simple people trying to live the good Christian lives without a whole lot of concern about theology. I mean, they're happy to talk about it, but it's not central to their practice. Their practice is much more about living in equality and peace with their fellow community members. All right, all of that before Luther, before what we understand to be the Protestant Reformation even began, 100 years before that. So Luther comes along in 1517, and he breaks Europe into religious fragments. Everything just shatters. After he says, no, people need to read the Bible themselves, and they need to sort out these religious questions by reading the Bible and by divine inspiration, he introduces this entirely new religious landscape, one that had been kind of already in existence in Eastern Europe, but he introduces a different heterodox system in the West as well by introducing a new kind of Christianity. Well, anyway, he and his friend Calvin and the Swiss scholar priest named Zwingli, they're just the beginning of the Reformation. At first, there's a big split between Catholics and Protestants, and then the Protestants start to split and splinter into a bunch of different faiths. The splintering kept splintering and splintering and splintering until you're almost down to individuals. In the 16th century, you've got to ask like an individual person, what do you believe? Because the constellation of beliefs were different from one person to the next. It was such a common thing to talk about, well, what do you believe? And is Jesus God or more than human or less than? These are things people talked about all the time. Another wild radical group that pops up very early during this period is called the Anabaptists. And we've heard about the Anabaptists because they caused all kinds of trouble early on in the Reformation. These people are like the radical Hussites, like those brethren people, trying very hard to live a good Christian life, separate from society, and radical egalitarians, which means property in common. We're going to sell our worldly goods, we're going to join them together, and we're all going to live together as equals in our community. This is terrifying for people who live in a super hierarchical, stratified society, that these people are rejecting the basic rules of government, the basic rules of society, that some people are in charge and other people follow rules, that some people fight wars and other people pay taxes. They rejected all of this. And so immediately are branded as dangerous heretics who reject God's law too, actually. They thought they were following God's law, but from the outsider's perspective, these people are rebels and renegades. And so they get attacked. They set up a commune and they get attacked in the city of Munster. Very violent, very famous example early on in the Reformation of what happens when people take religious liberty, understood as reading the book for yourself and coming up with your own understanding of what it says and what you should do in this life. When you take that too far, well, then you're going to end up in Munster, where you've got people refusing all law and order. And of course, there were lots of rumors about how, there was free love practiced in the streets and everything else because these people had rejected the rules of typical society. The Anabaptists become the bogeyman of the Reformation. Whenever anyone expresses slightly different views, they're branded as an Anabaptist, which means rebel, renegade, dangerous, heretical kind of person. Doesn't matter. The Protestant Reformation continues to spreads all across Eastern Europe. If you look at this map of 16th century Europe, we're now like in the 1550s, 1560s. This part where we're looking is striped. It's striped because it's impossible to say what people believed there. You've got every kind of Protestantism and a lot of kinds that don't even have names that are existing and flourishing in Eastern Europe, free from any kind of censorship. The Catholic Church just doesn't have the power to limit people's inquiry. And in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, my favorite state in Eastern Europe, which, if you're not as familiar with it, was a very large state in the northeast corner of Europe, the largest in Europe at the time, actually, and it covers all those modern states. So if you're thinking about it in your head, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, all the Baltic states, a little bit of Russia, all that territory was under a single king, and that king was the king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So when we look at that region, we see enormous religious diversity and no censorship, no check at all on people's beliefs. A lot of the reason for this is because they had always had different religions living next door to each other, and the Reformation was just the latest layer of distinction. Remember at the beginning I told you that Eastern Europe had missionaries coming both from Constantinople and from Rome. So from the beginning, they had different kinds of Christians. So now the Reformation's happened and you have Lutherans and Calvinists showing up. Okay, fine. We're used to this. We've had lots of different Christians. It's fine. We also have got some Jews and we got some Muslims and we've got Armenian Christians. We've got everything. And so they were perfectly comfortable with heterodoxy, different beliefs in one place. And they were used to managing their own affairs. The king was really quite weak in the sense that he didn't have a lot of power beyond the capital. He relied on the people in the countryside to govern themselves, and that kind of freedom was just taken for granted. So what does this mean? This means that every heretic who gets thrown out of Western Europe ends up in Poland because it's safe there. And here's a great painting of the king and his wife at the time. And he famously said, "I am not the king of men's consciences. If people want to believe different things, super." And his wife, who was Italian and perhaps more sophisticated in these matters, said, "Yes, honey, but the anti-Trinitarians are coming. Like the most radical, the crazy ones, the ones that deny the divinity of Christ. I mean, how do you even call those people Christians? They're coming." And he let them come, and he did nothing, and the Catholic Church did very little to limit the spread of these heretical ideas. So this is called the Radical Reformation. All these guys out there on the fringe coming up with their new interpretations of what the Bible teaches and how we should live and all that. A lot of intellectuals, Italian humanists who got thrown out of Italy and ended up in Switzerland. After they get thrown out of Switzerland, they go to Poland. A lot of the Bohemian Brethren and the Moravian Brethren who were living in their communes, they get under pressure in their homes and they come to Poland. And when they come to Poland, they become Polish Brethren. So you get the Brethren everywhere. Brethren churches also, we have some of those here in the United States because these people came as religious refugees later. Some of them end up in Transylvania. I'll tell you about them in a second. But in general, the Poles are very receptive. Polish citizens during this time, if they had any money at all, they sent their kids to study in Italy. The best universities were in northern Italy, and so the Poles grew up with these humanist ideas about how we should investigate all ancient texts, religious and secular, using our reason and investigating the languages and thinking critically about what this version and this translation says and what it all means, working things out for themselves. This is just part of their culture, this humanist culture that's popular in Poland at the time. And so they're perfectly happy. These interesting Italians come, they've got heretical ideas. Okay, super, let's talk to them. We can handle that. We've got a rabbi down the street and we've got a mullah and we can have dinner and we'll discuss religious questions, sure, absolutely. And this is what happens for the next several decades in Poland, especially in Krakow and other noble estates. Often a very wealthy nobleman would invite visiting intellectuals to come and have dinner and talk about the latest from northern Italy, the latest from intellectuals in Switzerland. What are they saying about the Trinity? What are they saying? Can a good Christian own slaves? Let's talk about that. All of this was part of the public discourse in Poland in the 1560s, 70s, 80s, just par for the course, including the crazy anti-Trinitarians, these people who were such free thinkers that they were willing to question one of the central pillars of Christianity, the Trinity. They were willing to say, well, maybe Jesus wasn't God. Maybe the Trinity isn't scriptural. It is hard to find scriptural evidence for the Trinity. I've looked in Hebrew, in Greek, in Latin. I don't see it. And people would talk about this openly. The most famous first anti-Trinitarian was this Spaniard named Michael Servetus. Servetus goes to talk to Calvin in Geneva about his ideas, his questioning of the Trinity. What does Calvin do? Burn him at the stake as a heretic. That is a bridge too far for most Christians during this time. Questioning the Trinity, too much. In Poland, par for the course. Perfectly standard. And this other Italian fellow named, his last name was sorry, let me get it right, Sozzini. Sozzini in Italian, it becomes Socinus in Latin. So the people who followed Socinus are Socinians. He takes the anti-Trinitarian idea and makes it pretty normal. He says, yeah, there's not scriptural evidence for the Trinity, and reason makes it kind of hard to understand how Jesus can be both the Son and God, co-eternal and of the same substance. So let's say that Jesus was not God. Okay. He takes that idea and spreads it throughout Poland, and a lot of people buy it, and they start calling themselves Socinians after him. And Socinians is another word that people like us, the freethinkers who are willing to question even the most fundamental tenets of the Christian doctrine, they get that label as well. And so these two guys, they spread their notions throughout Poland. Under the next king, the son of that first one, Zygmunt and Bona, the son was Zygmunt II, not hard to remember. His sister, Isabella, we're going to get to her in a moment, but they are born and raised in this environment. Humanists, studying religion, free thinkers, discussing all these things. They see no reason to shut it down, to institute some kind of censorship, to limit the ability of these groups to have political disputations, to print and write and do all the things that they do. So this party continues for another generation of leaders in Poland, perfectly fine. And one of the main reasons why Zygmunt II did nothing at all to limit the religious freedom in his country was because so many powerful people had adopted these really radical Protestant views. And this is kind of a funny story. This is a famous historical moment in Polish history. All Polish children have to learn about the union of Poland and Lithuania. They created this new commonwealth in 1569. It was a really big deal. The actual painting that I've shown you here is like the size of this wall. It's an enormous historical painting, and each of the characters represented there are real historical figures that a Polish child would recognize, like you and I would recognize Ben Franklin or Thomas Jefferson in that kind of picture. And about half of them are radical Protestants. In this era, it was just what educated, curious, bright people thought. They were exploring these ideas. And so the question of, instituting some kind of religious uniformity was insane in Poland. You couldn't imagine that. It was impossible, in addition to being not something anyone was interested in doing. So these guys write and publish, and they have printing presses, and they translate the Bible, and they create catechisms for kids. They do this in Polish. They do this in Eastern Slavic languages. I've got examples here in Latin, Polish, and it's in Slavic script that they were using out in Lithuania. Peoples, huge territory, but all partaking in this same free discussion about Christianity. First Bible made in Polish, translated in Polish, done by these folks. They were super interested in education and education for the regular folks so they could partake in a free and responsible search for truth, right? That's what they needed. And so some of our best scholarship, even poetry from this period, comes from anti-Trinitarians. So this situation does sound kind of exceptional, and in Europe at the time it was exceptional because this is the era of religious wars. In the West, in France and soon in Germany, people are killing each other left and right over very small religious differences. Poland is, they know that they're an exception to this story, and they want to keep it that way. After Zygmunt dies, he dies without an heir, and there's a succession crisis and a little bit of concern about what comes next. All the noblemen get together and they say, we got to make sure that our religious differences don't cause any kind of dangerous divisions, a civil war in our country. And so let's all just agree together that people can believe what they believe. And nobody's going to persecute anybody else because they have different religious ideas. We all have different religious ideas, right? So they do. They get together on a field outside of Warsaw, thousands of them, and they all agree that there will be no religious violence in their country. Just because we have to elect a new king, don't get excited about that. We will all work together. Nobody's persecuting anybody else. And they write this very important document. It's called the Warsaw Confederation. It is pretty much the first official document of religious toleration in Europe. Like, genuinely, we will not persecute anyone because they have different religious beliefs. And the ancient document, you see all those crazy seals on the bottom? Those are wax seals. You know, noblemen had those signet rings, and they'd press into the wax, and they would press their seal onto the document to show that they agreed to it. And so that shows you that there were hundreds of important noblemen who came and said, yes, we are okay with religious liberty, no religious persecution in our land, thank you very much. 1573. The French are literally killing each other in the streets between the Protestants and the Catholics. But in Poland, all good. All right, back to Isabella, Zygmunt's sister. Isabella grows up and she marries the king of Hungary. Hungary is the kingdom just to the south of Poland. There are a lot of connections between Krakow and Buda, perfectly normal. Her father's first wife was a Hungarian, so perfectly normal for her to go to Hungary and marry this guy named King John or János Zápolya. He was the leader of Hungary at that time. And she comes with all of her court, which means all of her religious advisors and doctors and scholars and everybody. She brings hundreds of them with her, and she sets up shop in Buda. And here, again, I know the geography is all different, but Krakow to Buda, not so far. The Kingdom of Hungary, and this is what I wanted to show you on this map, is in a really rough place in the middle of the 1500s. The Ottoman Empire has been growing very rapidly and expanding northward into Europe. And in 1526, there's a huge battle that the Hungarians lose, and this shatters the Hungarian kingdom. And it allows the Ottomans to work themselves up here and own these provinces as vassal states. They're not technically part of the empire, but the Sultan appoints the people in charge there, leaving only the eastern edge of what had been Hungary, called Transylvania, only the eastern edge of what had been Hungary, free from Ottoman influence. So Isabella and her husband János, they are kind of clinging to the edge of what's left of Hungary by the end of the 1500s. This region, as or more diverse than Poland. Religiously, ethnically, they have everything there. So when Isabella shows up, she's like, oh, okay, I know what this is all about. Heterodoxy is perfectly normal to me. She is, in a way, unlucky, but also really astounding. Her husband dies in battle, lots of warfare going on back and forth, less than a year after they're married. She has a son a couple months after he dies. And she says, you know, I think he's the rightful king of Hungary. There are other claims to the throne, notably a Habsburg, who thinks that he has a right to be the king of Hungary. But Isabella stands firm, and she says, no, no, my son will be the next king of Hungary. I'm just going to check with the Sultan, because at this point, the Ottoman Sultan is the most powerful force in this part of the world. I know, exotic, right? We're in Europe, but it's the Ottoman Sultan who's calling the shots. She goes to the Sultan, and this is actually an Ottoman painting, which is really awesome, from the 16th century. And if you look very closely, there's Isabella with her little tiny baby talking to the Sultan about making him the next king of Hungary and allowing her to be regent until he grows up. The Ottoman Sultan hates the Habsburgs, and so he says, absolutely, Isabella, it's yours. You are the regent of Hungary. Let that son of yours grow up, and he can be king, and I will support his claims. Awesome. So she does, and for the next 18 years, until he grows up, Isabella is basically in charge of what's left of Hungary. She works with the local nobles there to create another statement of toleration, very much like the one that she knew that her brother approved of in Poland. And this one, this is the first one, is even more familiar to us as our understanding of religious liberty. Let's see. We've decided that everyone may keep the faith he desires, including the new and old customs of worship. We have left matters of faith to their discretion so that it may happen as it pleases the estates, the citizens of the place. In this matter, however, no injustice shall be done to anyone. It's all good. No injustice to anybody. Believe what you want to believe. It is hard to appreciate how unprecedented this was in 16th century Europe. The idea that people could just work it out for themselves and no injustice would be done. Only in a crazy distant land called Transylvania is this imaginable. But, as I have shown you, these people have been in Eastern Europe, moving around, different names, different places, but people who are perfectly comfortable with heterodoxy and perfectly comfortable with finding a religion that works for them individual, they're there. And they come out in Transylvania during this era. Now that little boy does grow up. His name is Janusz Zygmunt, or John Sigmund, depending on which language you're operating in. In this part of the world, everybody, 3, 4 languages, that's just normal. It's just the way the people have to deal. So Jan Sigmund, we'll call him, Janusz Sigmund, he grows up, and his environment is like it was in Poland. It is incredibly diverse. That's my 5-minute warning, and good, I'm almost done. And he's comfortable with that. Isabella's comfortable with that. Lots of her advisors are these Italian humanist scholars, many of them medical doctors as well. You can see how medical doctors would be interested in investigating and figure things out for themselves. A lot of Protestant radicals were also medical doctors. Those people, they come to Transylvania with Isabella. They raise Jan Sigmund. So he grows up in this religious diverse environment, and he goes through all of them. He converts to Lutheranism. He's like, yeah, that's pretty good. But, oh, Calvinism. He converts to Calvinism. And then he's got another advisor who is an anti-Trinitarian. In Transylvania, they actually call them Unitarians. Finally, we get the Unitarian label. Unitarian advisor, and he likes that. And so he converts to Unitarianism, making him our only Unitarian king in history. Jan Sigmund, unfortunately, doesn't live very long. He's in a dangerous part of the world, but for the few years that he does reign, religious toleration is made the law of the land. There is a very famous preacher that we have run into, I think here because of our connections with the Transylvanian church, named Ferenc David in Hungarian. And he was an ardent Unitarian, and he stood up at the parliament in Transylvania, and he said, we need religious liberty because everybody has to sort this out for themselves. Everybody needs to read the book and be inspired by God and sort it out for themselves. We should have complete religious liberty, freedom of conscience. And the people in the parliament in Transylvania nod and say, yes, absolutely, we should. And they pass the Edict of Torda, which is what the Hungarians claim. The Poles and the Hungarians compete on this. The Hungarians claim the first statement of religious liberty made law in Europe. It did happen a few years before the Polish case, but it's also a little different. In fact, I think it's better. My Poles would be upset with me, but I think this is even more to our understanding of religious liberty. In every place, the preachers shall preach and explain the gospel, each according to his understanding of it. And if the congregation likes it, well. If not, no one shall compel them, for their souls would not be satisfied. But they shall be permitted to keep a preacher whose teaching they approve. No one shall be reviled for his religion by anyone, and it's not permitted that anyone should threaten anyone else by imprisonment, for faith is the gift of God. 1568, Transylvania. But they were accustomed to people learning different things, talking about it, talking to different believing people, and all getting along and agreeing that that's okay. Didn't last very long. Unfortunately, like I said, Jan Sigmund died a young man, and Hungary was under attack by both the Habsburgs and the Ottomans, so it was a very precarious hold on power. And Transylvania wasn't much of Hungary anyway. The next guy who comes in to power, the next Prince of Transylvania, is in fact an ardent Roman Catholic, but accustomed to having different kinds of people in his principality, and so he allows 4 religions to exist as the established faiths of Transylvania, and of course one of them is Unitarianism, because it had been in the religion of the elites a few years before. And so Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, and Unitarians are official, and he says, fine, choose one of those 4 and stick with it. And so at this point, Transylvanian Unitarianism, small movement, gets kind of frozen in time. It's not allowed to make any more innovations. It stops being the kind of free-thinking and seeking religion that we would recognize. It's not allowed to continue. A couple hundred years later, more people come and they pick it up and they continue the evolution. Same thing happens with the Poles. The Poles eventually get chased out. The Polish Brethren get chased out of Poland. They're viewed as just a little too radical. As the Catholic Reformation gets going, people become less tolerant of religious diversity. And so after about 100 years, that golden age of religious toleration ends in Poland as well. This guy, coincidentally, is elected Prince of Transylvania and then later King of Poland. So he's actually governing both of those states. By the 1650s, so 100 years or so after this golden age, most of the radical freethinkers are chased out of Poland and they end up in the Netherlands. They take a lot of their documents and their greatest scholars, they flee to the Netherlands, and from there many of those people flee to England. Later, they bring all of their learning, all of their textual analysis of the Bible, all their religious writings, they bring them with them in Latin so that anybody in Europe can read them. Those ideas go from the Netherlands, they go to England, and by the time you get to the 18th century, you start getting churches in England called Unitarian churches. Those people eventually come across the pond, and we get our modern faith. But it's a couple hundred years later that something called Unitarianism and something called Universalism formulates itself here. And then, of course, they don't join until 1961. And so, in a way, Unitarian Universalism is a New Age cult, right? We're not very old. I mean, honestly, we are. But in another way, if you look at it, we've been around for centuries. The seekers, the freethinkers, we've always been there. Just different names, different labels. That's it. Thank you. Yeah. I have a minute, but I also have to ask you if you would fill out this survey. because I know, the Adult RE Committee really wants to do more cool stuff, and we're always at a loss. What are people interested in, and what would they like to hear more about? And so if you could take a few minutes, I will take some of those. You can, maybe if you take half, and you can pass on your side, and you guys can pass there. And then if you have questions, if you're just dying to know more about